Well, this must be the place. Well, it's that time of year again. Good old autumn, where all the leaves fall, all the critters snuggle away for the winter, or begin to anyway, and the time that spoopy things are bound to happen. You know, everyone has their favorite horror icon, whether it's the wisecracking Freddy Krueger, whether it's the blank-faced Michael Myers, or whether it's the horrifically disfigured, yet charming, face of Leatherface. But for me, my favorite has always been Jason Voorhees and the Friday the 13th franchise. The series has gone from a simple mystery movie about a mysterious killer at a remote camp in the woods and has turned into a zombified serial killer with a hockey mask, killing everything in his path. Now that might sound like a big jump for a franchise, but it really isn't. And I'm going to be spending the 40th anniversary of this series explaining why that is. Now keep in mind, since these films tend to be pretty formulaic, I'm mostly going to cover them in a bit of a shorter format than I would with my normal reviews, and as well you can expect pretty big spoilers for most of the movies here. I'm also not going to be talking about Freddy vs. Jason or the games either. Freddy vs. Jason I'll probably save until after I've covered the Nightmare on Elm Street series. But here we go, let's do it. And what better way to do it than with the film that started it all.
The first Friday the 13th was released in theaters in May of 1980, directed by Shauna S. Cunningham and starring Kevin Bacon, Betsy Palmer, Adrian King, and a whole bunch of other people. The plot involves a group of young adults who take up jobs at Camp Crystal Lake, famous for the drowning of a boy named Jason Voorhees and the subsequent murder of 2 counselors. Attempting to put the history of the camp behind, the owners instruct the counselors to finish the reconstruction in time for the new campers. Things begin to get out of hand, however, when the counselors begin to go missing and they begin to realize that they might not be alone in the woods. Now, the first thing you've got to remember when talking about these movies is remembering the kind of content offered up in most of them, which is mainly lots of blood, gore, and nudity. In that sense, it's hard to outright complain about these movies sometimes, given that you pretty much get what you expect, but I can say for that the first movie in the series, Friday the 13th, does a pretty good job at being an entertaining slasher. The story sets itself up pretty well, and the kills are pretty entertaining. Where I think the movie really lacks, though, is in the character department. Every character in Friday the 13th is as hollow as they come. There's the token jock, the token hot chick, the token good guy, and they're all boring as shit and serve only as meat sacks to be punctured, stabbed, and slit. While it is entertaining when it happens, I just wish there was at least one character I gave a semblance of a crap about. The acting is okay throughout, though, and the music is instantly recognizable and iconic, especially when the chanting kicks in. If there's anything else I can sort of complain about, it's only one other thing, which is a pretty big spoiler, but you've had 40 years to watch it, and it's that Jason isn't even really in the movie at all, and it's his mother pulling the strings the whole time. I don't really mind this at all, but I know there's some people who might be annoyed at that given how attached he is to this franchise at this point.
Overall, for what was planned to be a simple slasher movie with a neat twist at the end and some pretty good performances, Friday the 13th actually turned out pretty well, and it's still an enjoyable film to watch to this day, and if you haven't, you really should. But of course, all popular films are bound to get a sequel, and we did just 1 year later with Friday the 13th Part 2.
Friday the 13th Part 2 was released in 1981, directed by Steve Miner, and once again stars Betsy Palmer and Adrian King in the movie's prologue, and then switches to a new cast of characters played by Amy Steele, John Fury, Kirsten Baker, among various others. Taking place after the events of the first movie, Alice is basically suffering PTSD from being the only survivor of Pamela Voorhees' murders. In the prologue, she suffers from a nightmare and then wakes up only to be killed by a mysterious attacker who isn't satisfied with only her, as we'll soon come to realize, as a slew of new young adults are back in the woods by Camp Crystal Lake at a counselor training center and aren't alone. Jason Voorhees is back from the grave and is ready to do his mother's bidding, which mainly just involves killing everyone who dares to venture near the lake. So once again begins the quest for survival under the watch of an evil murderer. Part 2's acting is just about as good and cheesy as the previous film, but what it basically does is crank everything up to 11 with a lot more kills, a lot more gore, and a lot more hot people to kill. But it does feel mostly the same as the first movie in that regard, which might be a problem for some people. The familiar music is back, and I like how they introduce Jason as a killer, despite the fact that they make his eventual appearance and reveal as the killer overshadowed as all hell. I can also say this movie does have one of the most iconic deaths in the whole series, involving a guy in a wheelchair, and I dare not spoil a thing about it. One last thing I'll mention about this movie that I liked in particular is that it plays with the concept of Jason just being an average dude, compared to the later parts of the franchise where he became this supernatural force. Here, Jason is just a crazy guy who wants revenge for the death of his mother and kills everyone who gets near his forest. There are a few issues I have with Part 2 overall, but the main issue I have is that Jason suddenly jumps from being a child zombie at the end of the first movie to an adult sort of zombie in this movie, and it just feels weird that the film seems to take place not that long after the first movie, yet Jason now has the body of a 30-year-old. In general, continuity would become an issue with these films, and not a lot is ever explained, and that is the most frustrating thing about this film in particular, but it persists throughout the franchise.
It is worth noting at this point that we probably wouldn't have a franchise if the second film wasn't at least marginally better than the first, and it is, and I would still recommend both of these movies. Now, where I would go from here is with the third film, Friday the 13th Part 3, which would introduce not only Jason's iconic look, but also a bit of his personality in the process.
Friday the 13th Part 3 was released in 1982, directed by Steve Miner again, and stars Richard Brooker as Jason, as well as Catherine Parks, Paul Kratka, Gloria Charles, and a myriad of other adults for Jason to kill. After the events of Part 2, Jason takes the machete that was used in an attempt to kill him and wanders off into the nearby town looking for more victims. After procuring some clothes for a nearby shop owner, he sets off to a nearby farm where a new group of people are ready to be made into mincemeat. Part 3 makes some new additions to the series, mostly introducing comedy into the mix, but the most important thing it added was Jason's signature look with the coat and the hockey mask. This would become the staple look of the iconic killer for pretty much the rest of time, as it solidified his look in thousands of minds across the world. The acting is once again the standard cheesy stuff in the previous movies, and it really starts to feel samey at this point, but with that same charm from the first two parts. The kills are once again as brutal and violent as ever, and there's so much blood in this to the point that it feels comedic in and of itself at this point. Once again, though, the biggest problem with Part 3 is the characters, as they're all just the standard stereotypes you've seen before. What did they add to make it better? They added stoners. Cool, very fun. I get the point of a slasher film is that you're supposed to want to see these people die, but there's gotta be at least one person I like. And in this movie, most of the characters are either boring or just assholes. There is an attempt to humanize these people, but it doesn't really work in combination with the cheesy acting. With that being said, the kills are still very entertaining, and that iconic first shot of Jason stepping out into the light with his iconic look is still incredible, but it lacks the depth it needs to be an amazing movie, and it needed more characterization beyond just the usual stereotypes. Thankfully, the next few movies would pick up the pace and quality to a ridiculous degree, with what I like to call the Tommy Jarvis saga.
So now that Friday the 13th had gotten the look of its signature killer down, really all they needed to do was just improve the one thing that I felt was lacking in the first three movies, which was the main characters. Besides Jason, of course. And what they did was introduce one little guy who would become the franchise's mainstay for 3 movies, good old Tommy Jarvis. And they introduced him in Friday the 13th, Part 4, The Final Chapter. A bit of a weird title, considering evidently it wasn't.
Friday the 13th Part 4, The Final Chapter, was directed by Joseph Zito and released in 1983, starring Crispin Glover, Kimberly Beck, Barbara Howard, and several other people, including Ted White this time around as Jason. Taking place immediately after the events of Part 3, Jason, presumed dead by an axe to the head, is taken to a morgue. Needless to say, the film wouldn't be very entertaining if he didn't survive and escape, which is just what happens as he makes his way into the woods again, where he comes upon the ever-so-tempting sight of several teenagers renting a house next to a lake, located right next to the residence of the Jarvises, where one young Tommy Jarvis is living with his mother and sister. Jason once again takes it upon himself to murderize everyone in the area as the quest for survival begins once again. Part 4 immediately gets bonus points from me for not only keeping Jason's signature look, but also introducing the character of Tommy Jarvis, who would become the most developed character in the whole franchise, aside from Jason himself. Tommy's character isn't exactly spectacular in this movie itself, but it's more so the fact that he's the first child character in the franchise, and that he was done so well. For what was becoming such a formulaic franchise at this point, Tommy's inclusion just makes the film that much more interesting, now that you have a few characters who aren't dickwads and who you want to actually make it to the end of the story, and the main one is a child. I don't care what anyone says, having a child at the risk of getting killed in any piece of media is always scarier to me. The kills are super violent and hilarious, and even when you know they're coming, they're still entertaining as hell to watch. Honestly, I have trouble thinking of genuine problems with Part 4, but if I had to name a few, I'd say it's mainly my issues with Jason. Now, I know I said I didn't have a problem with his appearance, and I don't, but how a random big dude is able to take a knife to the knee, a machete to the shoulder, and a goddamn axe to the head, all in the span of a day or two, and survive is beyond me. I know I said the movie wouldn't be very entertaining if he didn't make it, and I meant that, but there's only so much I can believe a man, even one who's supposed to be possibly undead, will take before biting the dust. Other than that, though, Part 4 is a great entry in the series, and it's still one of my personal favorites.
So with Friday the 13th, the final chapter, big surprise there, it wasn't the final chapter, as the movie was largely successful, and they continued on the trend of having Tommy be the main protagonist, essentially, and they sort of focused on developing him in the next movie, Friday the 13th, Part 5, A New Beginning, which in turn created one of the more unique movies in the series, and honestly, I would say one of the ones I enjoy the most.
Friday the 13th Part 5, A New Beginning was released in 1985, directed by Danny Steinman, and stars Melanie Kinnaman, Juliet Cummins, Tiffany Helm, and John Shepard playing the role of Tommy Jarvis, as the first protagonist in the series to make a second appearance outside of flashbacks since Alice in the first movie. This time, however, Tommy isn't here for just 5 seconds and then gone. Taking place many years after the events of the final chapter, Tommy is now a young adult moving into a new facility for troubled youth, still suffering massive trauma after killing Jason. Things just can't be all well and good for Tommy, though, as new murders begin to occur around the area, and Tommy begins to hallucinate seeing Jason everywhere. Once the murders reach the facility, it turns into an all-out battle for survival and sanity as Tommy must face his demons once again. A New Beginning has a lot of things I enjoy about it, and I think the biggest strength it has is Tommy returning as the protagonist. Having him back gives him more of a chance to develop as a character and gives us someone to root for again, especially after what happened to him in the last movie. He's a bit more of a silent asshole, but wouldn't you be if you had to single-handedly kill your sister's would-be attacker? The actors all do pretty good jobs, and there's not as much I can complain about in regards to the story. All the kills are awesome, and there's some neat plot points here and there that seem to indicate a certain direction they wanted to go with the series. There's even a cool element to Tommy's development as a character, which involves him slowly going crazy and hallucinating due to being psychologically scarred from killing Jason in Part 4. If I had to pick apart anything I didn't like about A New Beginning, I'd say that some of the characters besides the main kids are just complete assholes. There's a redneck family living next to the main house that's just pure annoyance pushed into a human carcass, and I wanted to strangle one of the people working with the kids, especially as someone who's dealt with shitty therapists in the past. Other than that, this is another extremely fun entry in the series, and it ranks among my favorites along with Part 4.
So you'd figure with the ending to A New Beginning that Friday the 13th would sort of go off on its own and kind of choose a new killer, that being Tommy Jarvis. But at the same time, audiences were pretty much raving for Jason to return, but he's dead, so how could he? What would ultimately happen next to bring him back creates not only one of my favorite slasher movies of all time, but also my favorite movie in the Friday the 13th franchise, with Episode 6, Jason Lives.
Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives, was released in 1986, directed by Tom McLaughlin, and stars Renee Jones, Jennifer Cook, Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis, and C.J. Graham as Jason Voorhees himself. Taking place many years after the events of A New Beginning, Tommy Jarvis travels back to the town of Crystal Lake to burn Jason's corpse in an attempt to rid himself of the hallucinations. He instead ends up resurrecting Jason, who becomes an undead, super strong, bulletproof zombie with an urge to kill. Filled with a desire for vengeance, Jason sets out to kill Tommy, who tries his best to convince the police and the rest of the town that Jason is alive again, all while Jason returns to Camp Crystal Lake, where a new batch of counselors is ready to be executed. Jason Lives takes the franchise in a sort of new direction. Whereas the old movies took themselves somewhat seriously, Jason Lives is about 50% comedy and 50% slasher. This movie is brimming with comedy, and the acting is delightfully cheesy to boot. Jason is a beast in this movie, and the kills are some of the best in the franchise. One of my personal favorites has to be when Jason is first brought back to life and straight up punches a dude through the chest and rips his heart out, all while Tommy just watches. Even still, all the parts of this movie just work together to create such a fun and enjoyable slasher that never gets old no matter how many times I watch it. Did I also mention there are campers in this movie? Yeah, For the first time ever, there are actual campers in a franchise centered around a camp. It's a friggin' miracle! Jason Lives pulls off the impossible and makes Friday the 13th an amazingly fun movie with the main villain given total respect by basically being a walking god. Now, like all the other movies, Jason Lives has to have the token asshole. This time around, it's none other than the sheriff who thinks Tommy is responsible for the killings. Every time this guy is on screen, I wanted to climb through it and shove a shotgun up his ass. There's little to no assholes otherwise, though, and the only other complaint I can levy against this movie is that if you don't like movies that don't take themselves seriously, you won't like this movie, or pretty much any of the other movies after this for that matter. Besides that, this is easily my favorite movie in the whole franchise, and if you had to watch any film from all of these, I would say go with this one. It's an enjoyable, fun-filled ride, which takes what was becoming a pretty stale formula and adds a layer of enjoyment to it that it desperately needed.
So with Jason Lives being as good as it was, I was interested to see what Part 7 would bring to the table, as Tommy Jarvis' saga being over meant he wouldn't really have a place in the franchise anymore, and I was nervous the new character that they would bring in would be an unfitting replacement. But surprisingly, Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, was actually a very good time.
Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, was released in 1988, directed by John Carl Buechler, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong, and stars Kane Hodder as Jason Voorhees, along with Kevin Spiritus, Terry Kaiser, and Lar Park Lincoln as the main protagonist of the movie, a telekinetic psychic named Tina Shepard. Taking place after the events of Jason Lives, Tina returns to her father's resting place, which just so happens to be Crystal Lake, many years after she used her telekinetic abilities to drown him in the lake as a child. When a doctor who wants to harness her power drags her out to the lake under the guise of treating her, she unknowingly reawakens Jason, still chained to the bottom of the lake after being drowned by Tommy Jarvis at the end of Part 6. With a whole new batch of teens within Jason's grasp, he sets out to murder everyone in the camp to gloriously brutal levels once again, all while Tina tries her best to harness her psychic abilities and stop the undead marauder. The New Blood tries its damnedest to introduce Tina as this new protagonist who we're supposed to root for, and I think it does its job well for the most part. The tone has been drastically changed from Jason Lives, and the film is a lot darker than its predecessor. Tina being a psychic could have been treated as a joke, but I thought it was handled very well and maturely. Jason is also even more gruesome looking than before, with the time under the water having worn away his skin and clothes to the point that his skeleton is showing, as well as the chains around his neck jangling together and making haunting noises as he limps around. The music is also a lot lower in tone than before, and I personally think this makes for some pretty intense scenes with Jason, as him looking a lot more like a walking corpse than before makes him even more intimidating. The movie also tries to use Tina's psychic abilities to further the plot, and there's several scenes where she has glimpses of the future, and she tries to prevent what she's seeing from coming true. It reminds me a bit of what Monolith Soft would eventually do with the story of Xenoblade Chronicles, which is one of my favorite games of all time, and I like it for that reason. Aside from that, there's not too many asshole characters either, and that's a big plus in my book. I think one of the only problems I have with The New Blood is the fact that Tina's powers aren't really given all that much time to develop in the long run, and I just wish there was more time to develop her as a character. All we really know is that she had an alcoholic father, and he didn't last long at the hands of her telekinesis. I get that I praised the hell out of Tommy after just one movie, but he got more development in Part 4 alone than Tina did here. Not only that, but spoilers, I guess, Tina doesn't ever return in the franchise. I realize that's not entirely the movie's fault, but it is something that bothers me. Other than that, though, The New Blood is a great sequel to Jason Lives in almost every way, and I definitely recommend keeping this one on your watch list.
So with Friday the 13th Part 7, The New Blood, being very enjoyable, you'd figure that the sequels would sort of keep building on from here, and they would be more enjoyable as time goes on, right? Well, not so much, given that Episode 8 is not only what I would say is the point where the series started to go on a downhill spiral, but also took the series to a new setting and to a new low that it really hadn't seen in a while, with Episode 8, Jason Takes Manhattan.
Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, was released in 1989, directed by Rob Hedden, and stars Jason Daggett, Scott Reeves, Peter Mark Richmond, and Kane Hodder once again reprising the role of Jason Voorhees. Taking place sometime after the events of The New Blood, Jason is reawakened from his resting place at the bottom of Crystal Lake alongside Tina's father under the docks when a couple electrocutes him back to life and he kills them both. Making his way towards a large cruise ship using the couple's boat, he boards and resumes his rampage by killing everyone on the boat, which eventually results in them fleeing to the closest piece of land, which happens to be Manhattan, where he follows them. In all honesty, I initially wrote this script with my first viewing of Jason Takes Manhattan, where I just remember the movie being average, but nothing special in comparison to the others. But upon rewatching it, I fucking hate this thing. I wanted to mark this thing as the point when Friday the 13th initially dipped in quality, but my god, the depth to which this thing fell is insane! Budget cuts apparently really hurt this movie, but regardless, the end product is just a boring shell of what Friday the 13th should be, and that's the best word I can describe Jason Takes Manhattan with. Boring. Some of the kills are entertaining, but the characters are back to being the dumb stereotypes that we saw in every movie before they started to give a damn about their protagonist with Tommy Jarvis. The entire movie feels like a regression in every conceivable way. None of the characters have any depth, none of them are interesting in the slightest, and none of them make this movie any better. I don't know how they did it either, but they somehow made Jason's makeup look worse. Jason himself isn't very interesting, and the stupid side plot that they try to shoehorn in like they did with the main protagonist of Part 3 doesn't improve things at all. On top of all that, why is this movie called Jason Takes Manhattan? Most of the group gets killed on the ship, and by the time they actually get to Manhattan, there's only half an hour left in the movie. A better title would have been Jason Takes a Ship. More like Jason Takes a Shit. I really don't have anything positive to say about this movie, and any time I could spend talking about it, I could spend praising the other movies. I know this is going to be harsh for me to say, but this is one of the few movies in the franchise I would recommend skipping. A proper continuation, this is not, and the confusing, hallucinatory storytelling and ending that doesn't make any goddamn sense makes me want to shove my head in a vat of toxic waste.
So, with Jason Takes Manhattan not being as good as it could have been, you figure things can only go up from here, right? Well, no, as we come to what is not only my least favorite Friday the 13th film ever made, but also what I think is quite possibly one of the worst horror movies ever made. This is Episode 9, Jason Goes to Hell.
Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday, which is basically Friday the 13th Part 9, was released in 1993, was directed by Adam Marcus, and stars Kane Hodder as Jason once again, along with Carrie Keegan, Aaron Gray, and Stephen Williams. Taking place after the events of Jason Takes Manhattan, the military sets up a coup to kill Jason, and they succeed by blowing him the hell up. Once Jason's destroyed body is taken to the federal morgue, the autopsy head is possessed by Jason's spirit, and then goes on a killing spree using other people's bodies. And then there's a guy who's got a baby with a girl, and Jason is trying to kill them. Look, I can't say this with any more seriousness. Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday is the worst movie in the entire Friday the 13th franchise. I really don't know where to start with this one, from the horrible story to the awful comedy that makes you want to jam your head into a machete, to the lame music that neither invokes a sense of horror nor humor. Jason Goes to Hell is absolute garbage in every way possible. First of all, they show the biggest disrespect to the franchise's mascot by blowing him up in the first 10 minutes of the movie. Then they try to add in this stupid-ass side plot with Jason being able to possess bodies, which makes no sense whatsoever. The characters are all shallow assholes and don't add anything, and even the ones you're supposed to like are some of the most hollow, empty characters you'll ever see in a slasher movie. The comedy in the movie is bottom of the barrel and boring, and again, that's the perfect word to describe Jason Goes to Hell. It's boring. Boring, 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 boring. This movie will bore you to the point of wanting to go on a psychopathic killing spree yourself. Not even the lazy and low amount of kills can save this giant pile of crap. There's no questioning when I say that this is the worst movie in the franchise, and if there was one movie in it I would recommend you drown in a lake, this would be it. Do not bother with this awful excuse for a Friday the 13th movie. Burn in hell, The Final Friday.
So after Jason Goes to Hell was a gigantic disappointment from every single angle possible, you'd have to have a sequel of cosmic proportions to be able to rise this franchise up from the deep hole it set itself in. But what they did next was not only completely out of left field, but also created what is, funnily enough, one of my favorite films in the Friday the 13th franchise, with the widely popular and also yet widely controversial Jason X.
Jason X was released in 2001, directed by James Isaac, and stars Kane Hodder as Jason, along with Lexa Doig, Lisa Ryder, Melissa Aid, and David Cronenberg? Yeah, David fucking Cronenberg is a character in this movie, as a doctor researching Jason, no less. Taking place around 450 years after the end of Jason Goes to Hell, which this movie thankfully disregards for the most part, Jason X takes place mostly on a spaceship led by a scientist teaching a class about Earth. When they discover Jason and a young woman cryogenically frozen in an underground bunker on Earth, the aftermath of the Army's attempt to subdue Jason, they take him aboard their ship to preserve and study. Of course, Jason is revived and begins his rampage, killing everyone on the ship. Jason X is the result of a franchise knowing exactly what to make fun of itself for and doing just that. If you go into this movie expecting anything except a ridiculous, fun movie, you're going about watching this wrong. This film is consistently entertaining and funny and never lets its setting or premise get in the way of entertaining the viewer. The music is back to the familiar tunes we all know and love, and the characters are appropriately suited to fit their futuristic stereotype counterparts. The kills are some of the most brutal and violent in the franchise as well, and they're pretty much all amazing. But the really entertaining part about this movie is Uber Jason. At some point in this movie, Jason becomes a giant mechanical zombie, and it is absolutely glorious. I dare not spoil much about him. The acting is all appropriately cheesy and fun, and I think the thing that makes Jason X such a great watch is that it's amazingly self-aware, and it's so refreshing to see a franchise with so many silly elements just make fun of itself for once. In terms of negatives with Jason X, I can say that if you're not a fan of the more serious side of Friday the 13th, you definitely won't like this movie, and I guess I'd be lying if I said I didn't miss that side of the franchise just a little bit, especially after the New Blood's amazing atmosphere. Jason is also just to the point now where he's so overpowered and invincible that it becomes laughable, and if you think that's disrespecting the character at all, then that might be a problem as well. Besides that, I love this movie, and it's even one of my favorites in the franchise. People who say that this movie is terrible and call it one of the worst horror sequels ever made completely miss the point of it. I'd highly recommend giving this movie a watch if you like goofy slasher movies.
So after Jason X, the franchise sort of took a hiatus for a while and returned later on in the 2000s with Freddy vs. Jason. But we wouldn't see a new standalone Friday the 13th movie again until 2009, when a soft reboot of the series, sort of, was made. And it was simply titled Friday the 13th. So, as the now end to the franchise, let's finish off this long and winding journey with Friday the 13th, 2009.
Friday the 13th, 2009 was obviously released in 2009 and was directed by Marcus Nispel, starring Derek Mears as Jason Voorhees, being the first person other than Kane Hodder to portray him since episode 7, along with Jared Padalecki, Danielle Panabaker, and Amanda Righetti. The first 20 minutes of this movie or so essentially retells the events of the original Friday the 13th, as well as introduces a new group that gets murderized in the opening sequence. The film then jumps to 6 weeks later, where a group of teenagers gets together at a lakeside house to hang for the weekend, and a relative of one of the initial teens stops by the area looking for her. Meanwhile, Jason is out in the woods looting for supplies and eventually comes across the group of meat sacks, and thus the carnage begins. Friday the 13th, 2009 takes things mostly back to the basics with the Friday the 13th formula and goes for straight-up horror over a goofy atmosphere. It's a lot more like the original movie with some comedy, but mostly a spooky tone. Now, this thing gets a lot of shit from the fan base and is usually seen as the worst in the franchise, but I'm gonna be completely honest, I don't hate this movie. I don't know why, but this film doesn't bother me as much as it seems to for everyone else. The kills are entertaining and enjoyable, the setting is back to the forest of Crystal Lake, and the scary atmosphere lends to some pretty tense moments. The acting is good, but not amazing, and I like the aspect of Jason being a lot more mobile and fast in this movie, as opposed to a lot of the other movies where he just kind of skulk around. It gives me the vibes of Part 3 and 4, and it makes me really happy. Now, as much as I like this movie, I do have a few problems with it. For one, even though there's a protagonist I like, there's not much in the way of depth with any of them. The camera work is also a bit of an issue, and a lot of shaky cam is prevalent throughout the movie, which if you've seen my 28 Days Later review, you know I really don't like. I think the biggest issue with this film, though, is that it just lacks the one thing that the older movies had, and that's a soul. The movie is good, but in the grand scheme of things, it just doesn't feel much like a Friday the 13th movie, and feels more like a modern slasher. Overall, though, I'd recommend at least giving this movie a watch. Who knows, you may end up liking it like I did. For a reboot, this could have gone a lot worse, and I still find it an enjoyable movie. And with that, we come to the current end of the franchise.
Well, that about wraps that up. It's been a wild ride. And, like I said before, people are free to like whatever they like, People have, the ghosts, the many ghosts of Poltergeist to look forward to each Halloween. Other people would prefer to see the maniacal of the Joker, But in my opinion, Jason's just the one that kind of fills that sort of rotting, zombified hole in my heart. The one thing I don't get, though, is what's with all the "there's a death curse" stuff? I mean, it's complete nonsense. It's literal. There is no logical reason at all that he's standing right behind me, isn't he?
Bye-bye.